welcome back to the Prospect Podcast. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Alona Ferber.
And today we'll be joined by Sudanese-born writer and broadcaster Yassmin Abdel-Magied. Yassmin, hi.
Thanks for having me.
Yassmin was formerly an engineer, and she is the author of Talking About a Revolution, among other texts. And she was also an ABC broadcaster in Australia before moving to London in 2017. Yassmin's joining us today to talk about what aid organisations have called the world's worst humanitarian crisis, namely the situation in Sudan. Just a heads up, in this episode we will be talking about violence, including sexual violence. But let's get started. So Yassmin, it's very lovely to have you with us here at Prospect.
Thank you, yeah. I'm looking forward to getting to it.
So the war in Sudan is one of these stories of massive international significance. But many of our listeners probably will know very little about it, and we can get into the reasons why that might be. But could you, for the benefit of the listeners, just sort of explain what's been happening in Sudan, how long for, who's been affected?
Yeah, so what we've got happening at the moment is a counter-revolutionary war. People describe it as a civil war, but myself and many other sort of civilian activists and writers and so on call it a counter-revolutionary war. And for it to make sense, I'm going to take us a little bit back. I'm going to take us back in time to late 2018, 2019, where we saw a sort of grassroots, non-violent resistance movement, and ultimately what's known as the December Revolution. The Sudanese people sort of rose up against a 30-year sort of dictatorship. Omar al-Bashir had been in power since 1989, a really violent, oppressive, authoritarian regime. And there had been attempts to overthrow that regime a number of times over the years. But finally, in April 2019, that Omar al-Bashir was deposed. Now, there was, a few different things happened. But then in around August 2019, you had what was called a transitional military council set up. And it was an agreement that you would sort of have this group of people, part military, part civilian, that would see Sudan into the democratic, civilian-led stage of governance. And this is really important to understand what we're talking about. The Sudanese people really wanted a civilian-led government. However, that transition was meant to be about 3 years or so. 2 years in, so October 2021, the two sort of factions that we see fighting today sort of got together and said, you know what, we are meant to be passing on, power to the civilians at the moment, but actually we don't want to do that. We want to protect the civilian movement. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a coup. So they overthrew that kind of transitional council and they took power. However, you had these two factions, the sort of traditional Sudanese armed forces, and you had another group called the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and they worked together to overthrow that transition. But then there was a debate about who was going to be the overall leader, right? And there was tensions between the two. Now, the RSF, it's worthwhile knowing, is a group that used to be known as the Janjaweed. So the group that was responsible for the genocide in Darfur in around 2003, which your listeners might be aware of, they were formalized by Omar al-Bashir into the RSF in order to kind of be his militia in the West that would deal with the rebels. And this is something Bashir did very well. He empowered different militias in different parts of Sudan so that no one would ever actually overthrow him. And that group, the RSF, and the leader of that group, Egpyt, decided, well, actually, we don't want to be subsumed into the army anymore, because that was kind of the deal that we want to fight for overall supremacy. And so in April 2023, what you saw was the explosion of these tensions. You saw the RSF coming into Khartoum, which is the capital city, a city that, despite Sudan's history of violence, Khartoum hadn't seen warfare since the Brits, right? Over 100 years earlier. And so very quickly, the RSF took land in Khartoum, and we saw this, huge exodus of people from Khartoum. And then, the war sort of spread out across the country. So where we are today, and it's quite interesting, we're having this conversation on the 11th of February, and there's been quite rapid sort of changes in the dynamics over the last sort of couple of weeks, which is really interesting, because the RSF had taken over quite a lot of land across West, and it had controlled a lot of Khartoum, and it had controlled Wad Madani, which is kind of like in Al Jazeera, which is the main sort of breadbasket of Sudan. But in the last month, the Sudanese armed forces has been pushing back, and it has sort of retaken quite a lot of land. And in amongst all of this, you have this enormous humanitarian crisis. You have half the population displaced, millions of people with acute humanitarian, needs, famine, declaration of genocide in the West. And so to sort of sum it up, to sort of say where we are today, yes, there is the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, and we can see them as sort of two groups fighting against each other. But I think what is more important to understand is you've got two kind of military complexes fighting against the Sudanese people, right? And fighting against the will of the Sudanese people to have self-determination.
To have a civilian.
To have a civilian-led government, exactly. And I think this is the thing that I will personally come back to, because you'll hear in lots of different conversations people either supporting the rapid support forces or supporting the Sudanese armed forces and kind of saying that, one has more sovereignty over the other or whatever. But from my perspective, ultimately, this is a war that is trying to quell popular resistance and quell the kind of will of Sudanese people. And that's what we need to come back to, is like, how do we empower Sudanese people to govern themselves and run the country that they live in?
And you were born in Sudan, and you've got family there still. This is very personal for you. Could you tell us a little bit about what was Sudan like the last time you visited? And what's it like for you to sort of watch this in the diaspora unfold?
So the last time I was in Sudan was for my wedding. And it's funny because...
When was that? What year was that?
February 2020. So everyone knows we just had our anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you. February 2020. So just before the pandemic. And sort of in this brief, beautiful period where the revolution had happened, people were sort of feeling this optimism, an optimism that I had never experienced in Sudan before, this like beautiful joy about the future. And I mustn't, it wasn't perfect, right? Like Hemeti and the RSF were making life difficult. There were petrol, it's difficult to get fuel. It was, things were very expensive, but still there was this sense of kind of hope and possibility. But my wedding has also taken on this strange resonance in my family because it was the last time everyone was together, right? Because then we had the pandemic, and then in 2021 you had the coup, and the war began soon after that. And so it's also strange because my memories now, the hall we got married in, the house that I was born in, the house that, I got prepared in as a bride, like all of those places are destroyed. And that is quite a strange thing to sort of get your head around. But I'm not unique. Every Sudanese person now has a story of their home. And I should also say that like I am one of what people would call the Khartoum elite, right? My parents went to university, we are Arab technically. And so the kinds of stories and the kind of grief that we are facing, it has been shared by Sudanese people across the country for many, many decades, right? But it came to the capital. And so that kind of sense of like, oh God, the war came to the capital, and that was never the deal, right? It was never meant to happen. But coming back to the personal, I mean, everybody, my father's family sort of had more connections to Egypt, and so they got out within about a month. And everyone sort of left everything behind, got on the buses. But my mother's family, who, are of a different class, perhaps didn't have as, not all of them had passports, not all of them had the funds. Some, they were displaced from their homes, but they weren't all able to leave. So one of my aunts still lives in Khartoum, in Bahri, and we hear from them every once in a while when they're able to sort of connect to a Starlink. Like, it's outrageous that my ability to speak to my parents or my family is connected by Elon Musk's satellite company. It's like it's a complicated feeling. It's a complicated feeling. Yeah. I'm like, go get the Starlink connection, but also let's talk about Elon later. Yeah. And then one family I mean, only just very recently, there was a real a massacre in a village that my uncle was staying in with his family, and they like just got out by the skin of their teeth and were able to smuggle themselves out through Libya. Another family also sort of stayed on the road for about a year and eventually, made it out, and now are in Saudi. And so, everyone is everywhere, and there's, I think, and this is a shared sense of displacement amongst Sudanese across the country and across the world. If you were able to get out, you did. If you were able to find a place of respite, you tried to. But even those who were able to get out, life is not easy after that, right? Mm-hmm. Egypt is not a hospitable place for Sudanese people at the moment, and that's kind of been a thing of tension for a while. I mean, across the border there, it has been called its own humanitarian crisis because, it's in the middle of the desert. That crossing is very difficult. The Egyptian authorities haven't really wanted to make it easy for Sudanese, especially since you had, almost 1 million people plus coming through. Obviously, the situation in Chad, across the border with Chad, you've got like tens of thousands from Darfur escaping, mm-hmm. hundreds of thousands. And that, again, I mean, the stories that I hear from my family is that everyone they've met along the way has done the utmost they can to help. But you're talking about not much aid coming through, not much access, very meager resources shared amongst huge swathes of people. You mentioned sexual violence, the threat of sexual violence. So it's kind of surreal, I think, because also, like Sudan is a place where people have sort of lived alongside, there's always kind of been in different parts of Sudan. You understand that there is violence, but there was always ways and places for you to escape that. Mm-hmm. But for the last almost 2 years, it's felt like those places of safety are fewer and fewer.
Yeah, I mean the story that you've told there, and some of the experiences of your family members, although they've had to go to different places and different things have happened to them, all of that is kind of world changing for them. And so in this story of kind of mass displacement, hunger, violence, every one of those stories is absolutely, hugely important. And yet, as we sort of said at the beginning, so this war has been called sort of the forgotten war. It's not something that's been perhaps discussed as often or as prominently as other conflicts. Why do you think that is?
Oh, Ellen. It's funny. I think that I have such a complicated relationship, sort of personally, with the concept of Sudan being a forgotten war. I started being asked about this probably when the war started in Gaza, right? Mm-hmm. And soon after that, a journalist started asking, oh, what about this other war, right? And we found ourselves as Sudanese people in this difficult position because we were happy that people were now asking about the war and paying attention, but we were also quite aware that sometimes it was used as a way to avoid talking about something else that they didn't want to talk about, right? And also, you've got the war in Ukraine. And again, as Sudanese people, we're very aware that what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening in Gaza are terrible things and they should be paid attention to. And at the same time, there's this sense that, oh, there is an enormous humanitarian crisis here. There's an enormous political crisis here. And it's not even like a lack of interest. It's almost as if like it's invisibilized, right? And you hear words like, or you hear phrases like, oh, it's too complicated. We don't understand. How is it actually connected? They'll be like, well, this other war has these implications and this other war touches on these other issues. And I think partly there is an ignorance, frankly, about Sudan, about its context, about the role that it plays, about the fact that it sits, it is connected to what some term as sub-Saharan Africa, and it is connected to the Arab world, and it is connected to the Sahel, and it is on the Red Sea. So it is really at the intersection of all these very important geopolitical kind of environments. You have Saudi, the UAE, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, all involved. You have arms coming from, the arms only come from a handful of countries around the world. And so we know that arms are coming from the UAE, for example. And where does the UAE get arms from? Well, it gets arms from the United States, arguably the UK. On the other side, you have the Sudanese armed forces that's having literally right at this moment, Russia has invited the foreign minister of the Sudanese armed forces for a meeting in Moscow because Russia's, wants a Red Sea port. And so you've got all of these things happening. But it's as if, like, I don't know, because it's on the continent of Africa, maybe it doesn't matter, because you get the sense that, oh, well, the Sudanese people are always fighting. Oh, it's a civil war. You'll hear this kind of language of civil war used as a way to dismiss what is actually going on, rather than understanding that what you're seeing is a movement against, as I said, like a popular resistance movement. And when we look at the kind of the scope of what's happening around the world, authoritarianism, tyranny, etc., that is on the rise. And Sudan is an example of the people trying to resist that. And rather than paying attention to that, we say, well, let's just see it play out. And of course, you can also say, yes, there's anti-Black racism. Yes, there's the sort of the hangover of, colonial sentiments and all of these sorts of things. And, if I'm to give people the benefit of the doubt, there's a lot going on in the world, right? And so people are a bit exhausted and they're like, God, I don't know how to engage in some new thing that I don't understand, right? And so I think my personal kind of mission has been, how do I talk about Sudan in a way that people can understand, in a way that doesn't infantilize or simplify what is going on, but to sort of communicate the urgency, communicate the importance, and also, I guess maybe not as pointed to say point out the hypocrisy, but to kind of say, if we say that we value all of these things, if we say that we value the, international law, if we say that we want to support people standing up against tyranny, if we say all of these things, like, here is an example, here is a place where we can do that. Why not?
Yeah. So, just sort of following up on that invisibilized word that you used. Is somebody doing the invisibilizing? I think what I'm trying to get at is basically, you've talked about the media and what is covered in the media, what British media, American media thinks is important. What do you think would have to change within the media to stop this war being invisibilized? Yeah,
no, it's a great question. I mean, editors need to commission more pieces about it. People need to, like the number of times that I've pitched things and people have said, well, we don't, what's the kind of news angle here? Like, what's the hook? Like, what's the, and I understand that, that there is a way that journalism works, but we also find ways to talk about things that we think are important, right? We find ways to highlight stories. And so I think that, like, making sure, this conversation to this audience is important. And perhaps this audience might kind of say, well, we want to continue knowing what's going on. And once you provide that sort of umbrella, like bird's eye view, okay, now we can start to get a little bit more into it. Because ultimately, where I think we want to get is a place where people don't just kind of know the headlines, but they actually understand what's going on. They actually are invested in what's going on. And so when they see or hear something, they can differentiate. Is that actually Sudanese armed forces propaganda? Is this actually a good thing? Like at the moment, one of the interesting things that's happening is that, the Sudanese armed forces is taking back land in Khartoum, it's taking back land in Al Jazeera, and there's a lot of reporting that, oh, this might be a good thing. Maybe. And also, if you're a little bit more aware or if you're a little bit more engaged, you might also pay attention to the fact, well, there's quite a lot of reprisal sort of executions that are happening. Anyone who's seen as like related to or supportive of the rapid support forces is taken away and tortured, is, killed extrajudicially. And also you might start paying attention to what the Sudanese armed forces is saying, which is that, anyone who does not support them or anyone who might be seen as supporting the rapid support forces, including any volunteer, any humanitarian worker, anyone who's been working in the emergency response rooms, anyone who they think, quote unquote, they're positioning them as foreign, right? And this is really interesting language. All of a sudden, the Rapid Support Forces, well, they've got loads of South Sudanese people, apparently. This is what the Sudanese Armed Forces will say. They've got loads of South Sudanese people fighting for them. They're actually not Sudanese. And so you start to see this nationalistic and xenophobic language be used. So is it actually a good thing, that they are taking back land? And if you have an understanding, a more kind of granular understanding, we can then have that more interesting conversation about what's going on. So editors need to commission more stuff on this. I think getting voices from the ground. I mean, the people, volunteers and so on working in emergency response rooms, fortunately, they have access to intermittent, but access to WhatsApp, access to communication, so we can actually speak to them and ask what is happening on the ground. I love, as part of the diaspora, I love being able to speak like on the war, and I love also being able to uplift the voices that are kind of there doing the work, and then not being maybe so afraid of the conflict and not being like, oh, I don't really know, right? Like Ukraine is complicated, Gaza, Palestine, Israel is complicated, but we throw ourselves into trying to understand it, right? So let's do the same here.
Is part of the issue the kind of the lack of journalists on the ground, like the fact that you're not getting, it's harder to pass whether something is propaganda or not if you don't have people there who are sort of reporting back? I mean, or is that just an excuse?
Yeah, I mean, a bit of column A, a bit of column B. I think it is true. Like Omar al-Bashir, the previous dictator, worked out loads of international humanitarian workers and so on. And also he Arabized the education system. And so you've got a lot of people that are doing excellent journalism, but maybe primarily in Arabic. And so you've got this language issue where, an English journalist might find it easier to like just pay attention to what's being written in English rather than trying to find a journalist that speaks in Arabic and get a translator and whatever. So I think that some of it is that lack of access. And, it is also very dangerous for journalists on the ground. At the same time, there is some fantastic, so there is something called Ater, which is this, it's like a weekly magazine that's come out, and it came out of a group of journalists in Sudan. They're kind of headquartered now out of Nairobi, but they produce a weekly magazine in Arabic and a bi-weekly one, I believe, in English. That is kind of, it's fantastic. It's real grassroots reporting. They have stringers all over the country. And that is a resource, for example, if people were aware of it, that they could get stories from, right? And so there are a few other examples of things like this happening that are just fantastic. And it's about how do we kind of amplify the voices already doing the work, because, then we can kind of have a more robust conversation.
Yeah. We wanted to ask you about the reports of sexual violence in this war, which seems to be one of the defining features of the conflict, and one of the things that makes the kind of lack of curiosity about it or neglect about it seems to me kind of even more problematic in a way. Yeah. But how do you see it? Do you? Is it a defining characteristic of the war? And do you think that that there's a risk that it's being overlooked in the general reporting of the war? Or has it been highlighted enough, do you think?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I hadn't conceived of it as a defining characteristic, but I think you could make the argument that it is, and there has been, like, I think it was Reuters that did a special report probably like maybe over a year ago now on some of the ways that, sexual violence, quite awful sexual violence, is weaponized and used primarily, my understanding is primarily by the Rapid Support Forces, but not limited to, and kind of used as a way to kind of break the back of communities, and break the will of the Sudanese people. And there are some stories, some horrific stories of people, for example, like groups of women choosing to commit suicide, essentially, rather than be subject, which is kind of like just wild. When you think of hundreds of women choosing to take their own lives rather than be subject to the sexual violence that they know is coming, I don't know that we've actually, to your point, I don't know that we've actually engaged with that. What are the implications? Why are people doing that? You've also kind of got this now legacy almost of many, many women who've been impregnated by, through this sexual violence, and babies being born into this, very difficult context. Something I know that is happening. So the emergency response rooms that I mentioned earlier, there's sort of these grassroots solidarity movements that was started as the resistance committees sort of during the revolution. Actually, mutual aid networks kind of had existed before, but they've sort of formalized. But they've recognized that the issue around sexual violence is so important, such that they now part of, not only are they sort of delivering humanitarian aid and food and so on and medical assistance, but they're also providing spaces for women and girls to as safe harbor. And they're also looking at how do we provide psychological support, which again, to me is incredible that you've got these sort of grassroots volunteers in a war zone thinking, how do we provide psychological support for women and girls that have been sexually abused? But it's also vital, right? Because this is perhaps, I think we are accustomed to talking about, murder and maiming and injury when we talk about war. But I think the kind of the psychological and the physical injury from the sustained waves of sexual violence, I think it, at the very least, I'm glad that you asked, and I feel like there are occasional kind of reports of it on it, but if we don't address the kind of full scale of it, it will be something that unfortunately kind of continues to fester alongside all of the other tragedies.
If we talked a bit about the different agents working in this war, about the RSF, about this is like a war within Sudan, but also the arms that come in. And some people might say that this is in a way sort of a proxy war. Is that would you characterize the war in that way?
I think I can understand why people would characterize it as a proxy war. Because that's like one of the terms that we have for this kind of context. But I'm not sure that I would characterize it as a proxy war. I would kind of characterize it more as kind of like a kind of war of opportunity in a way, right? Everyone is kind of seeing what they can grab and seeing how they can extract as much as they possibly can from a very resource-rich country, and also, and this is like I think a sort of difficult truth. At the moment, there aren't that many incentives for people to stop the war, right? Sudan historically has not ended wars through a military conclusion, right? Typically, it's a political solution. But both sides at the moment, and I shouldn't really say both sides, but let's say both parties, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF, both believe that they can kind of have the military victory. In order for that to happen, though, both the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF need to be sustained and need to be upheld and by the external factors and the external parties that we talked about. But I don't think, for example, that the UAE is fighting or is supporting the RSF because it wants to, win the war against Qatar or Egypt, right? That's kind of not really the dynamic. The dynamic is the UAE gets gold, gets livestock from the RSF or the or Himeti, the sort of the family. It's almost kind of like a family operated unit, right? Because of the way that it's structured, and they run mines, they have the agriculture. I think most recently I saw actually like some open source analysis looking at a whole new runway that has been built in order to like smuggle gold out. So from the UAE's perspective, they're like, we're getting some resources. We're getting land, we're getting livestock. As long as we can, as long as we can kind of keep the RSF sweet, we get something out of this. On the other side, Egypt, I think, is much more interested in stability in the region. It is, it doesn't necessarily, and it is not interested in kind of dealing with a militia. And historically, there's kind of been connections with, the traditional Sudanese armed forces. And then you've kind of got Russia that has wanted, it's funny, the kind of conversation about the Red Sea port. because for a while it was almost like it was in the realm of conspiracy, but actually if you pay attention, it's really useful, especially with changes politically in Syria and so on. And so there are lots of different things happening, and I think rather than thinking of it as a proxy war, it is kind of like a grab an opportunistic kind of grab. And in a way, if you've kind of got this like hotbed of instability, well, that's a great place for for terrorism. It's a great place to sell weapons. It's a great place to kind of benefit from the chaos. And if no one's really paying attention, well, that works. That works for a lot of actors. Actually, no one's actually paying close attention. And something I often say to Europeans is like, well, you think the previous migrant crisis was bad? Wait till 25 million people have nowhere to go, right? Like, and again, I'm kind of being a bit glib, but frankly, like a majority of the people in Calais are Sudanese because they're looking for places to go and they're looking for safety and they have to go somewhere.
Yeah. It strikes me when you're talking about earlier as well about all the different kind of countries that are involved somehow in the conflict. And I was just thinking back to after the 7th of October when the war started in Gaza and people were talking about, will this be World War III? Everybody's involved. What if all these different... And at the same time, you already had this war from April that year where so many different countries and powers are involved, and it's really interesting to me that kind of there's it's almost kind of siloed away as a kind of a conflict, almost like a hermetically sealed conflict, even though like everybody's involved and there's all these interests there, which I guess speaks to like the lack of curiosity about the conflict. Do you think like, I mean, is part of the answer to getting people quote unquote more interested to explain to them that there is that it is something that has, like you say, global implications, or is that actually again just another excuse? And really, we should be interested because it's an enormous humanitarian crisis, and that's why we should be interested in this conflict.
I mean, I would love for people just to be interested because it's important, but that's not what's happened, right? So it's interesting to then kind of think about what other ways we can kind of get people to pay attention. I think it is. I kind of conceive of Sudan sometimes as maybe not as bright as the canary in the coal mine, but it is an interesting, almost like worth paying attention to see how different regional powers are flexing and are kind of moving in order to then understand what they might do next, right? Turkey, for example, said some months ago now, they were like, well, we think that we can get the people at the table because they're, trying to position themselves. Erdogan is trying to position himself as like the regional peacemaker, right? You've got, again, like Saudi trying to position itself as the neutral party, which is why many attempts at peace talks were in Saudi and kind of positioned. Qatar also similarly, given the role it's recently played in Israel-Palestine, like everyone. And I think what's fascinating to me about this is that like the geopolitical landscape is shifting quite rapidly in front of our eyes at the moment, right? You've got Trump administration, you've got Putin in Russia, you've got China, you've got Iran and things changing with Iran. I mean, interestingly, Iranian drones have turned up in Sudan, and like that's also a support of the Sudanese armed forces. But within the kind of the Swana Middle East region, you've got all of these sort of regional powers, Saudi, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, and they're all trying to kind of position themselves as the big dog in the area, right? And I think Sudan is a really interesting example or really interesting case study in how they are either succeeding or failing, or how they're kind of moving in order to try to make that happen. And if anything, that's worth paying attention to. Is Turkey going to be able to get the right people at the table? Saudi has tried time and time again. Also you've got Ethiopia, you've got Nairobi. Like they're also trying to, Nairobi sort of positioning itself as the civilian kind of landscape. And a lot of kind of Sudanese elite went, if they didn't go to Egypt, they kind of went to Nairobi. It is not clear who's going to come out on top, but it is definitely interesting to kind of see who is positioning themselves and how, in order to understand what they might then do and what their strategy is going forward for the regional, because also a lot of capital is coming out from this region. A lot of money in this region, right? In a time where Europe, is having its own money problems. There's a lack of there's a lack of clarity maybe for how things are going to move forward for the Trump administration. So a lot of the UK, a lot of other people are sort of looking at the UAE, Saudi, Qatar, etc. for capital.
Yeah.
How is that? We need to understand where the money's coming from.
Does the UK have a role or responsibility in this process? And if you sort of had the ear of Keir Starmer, David Lammy, what would you be saying to them about what the UK
It's been really interesting to see David Lammy's kind of movements on Sudan recently, because to give the UK credit, they did try recently, because I think they were pen holders at Security Council, so they did try to kind of get a resolution across, a very sort of basic support the people kind of resolution that was vetoed, I believe, by Russia. But David Lammy does seem to have taken on Sudan as an issue that he wants to care about, right? And I can see how it can play politically for him, because he's having difficulty in other areas, and so I think the role for Britain is interesting. I think we've got a role in deciding where our weapons go, right, and deciding who we sell our weapons to. And if you're sort of selling weapons to the UAE and they're ending up in Sudan, that's something you should really reconsider. I think we have a role in the fact that quite a lot of money from the Emirates and so on comes into the UK, and if we want to really flex, maybe we can push back. And again, I think it was David Cameron who made a statement sort of pushing back against the UAE, and the UAE really got upset at that, very quickly responded, and then there was a bit of backtracking. So you can kind of see the British trying bit by bit here, but I think having a much more thought through strategy about an approach that engages the Sudanese civilian, right? And I think that's, there are a lot of institutions in the UK that can support civilian movements, right? And really help, all the stuff around democratic transitions and all that good stuff that the UK likes to be very proud of. Well, how about you sort of put some of that might and some of that support to the Sudanese, emergency response rooms, for example. And so you kind of beef up the grassroots solidarity networks that are already there, so that there is not this enormous vacuum, kind of once the military crisis is over, right? And so I think the UK has a place to. Also, you've got a huge Sudanese diaspora here, right? You have a really a role that can be played. You're not part of the European Union anymore, so you can't kind of position yourself as a sort of superpower in that way. But there are a lot of resources that I think can be deployed strategically.
And just we're coming near to the end of our time. It'd be nice to think a little bit kind of ahead, and hopefully, maybe.
Inshallah,
What do you hope for? What can you be optimistic about in terms of the resolution of the conflict, but also kind of justice afterwards, like the ways in which we can get redress for what's happened?
I have to remain hopeful, I think. Over the last almost 2 years, people have said things, well, it's a new Somalia, oh, it's a new Libya, all this, all that. And these are terrifying prospects. But also, I think they undermine the work, the real graft that Sudanese people on the ground and in the diaspora have kind of put into justice. And I think I just still have faith in that. I have faith, and I think what lets me down every time is not necessarily the Sudanese people. It's kind of the institutions. It's the countries and taking the easier path and dealing with the military generals rather than being like, how do we support a just transition and so on. Hopefully, maybe we will see a ceasefire. However, I believe that a political solution and a ceasefire kind of needs to happen at the same time. I think Sudan is a really interesting, thinking about how we deal with genocide years how we deal with, large groups of people who have committed major and horrific crimes. I think that is a process that Sudan needs to go through. But I do think that, as much as people are very tired, as much as people are, hungry and exhausted and traumatized, I think the revolution for an entire generation, like my generation and younger, our entire lives was under one dictator, right? And then there was this kind of sense of, things could be different. And that generation of people I don't believe will accept anything but a just transition, a civilian-led government. And it might take a very long time, but I think that's the thing that makes me proud to be Sudanese, and that's the thing that I think we might not quite yet know how we get there, but that's the North Star.
If our listeners want to go away and continue learning about the war, can you recommend any resources, any sources of reporting, things like that they could search for?
For sure. So I would say that Sudan Tribune and Radio de Banga are some excellent kind of grassroots. They're like websites that sort of have very Sudan focused, and you can get some information about what's happening on a daily reporting kind of level. I would look for Atar, so ATAR is this kind of bi-weekly magazine. You can get it on WhatsApp. They sort of send it to you, and you can find them through social media. So that's how you can find them. I run a site called eyesonsudan.net. That's a sort of portal to lots of different resources and some reading that people could do. And also, if you're on social media and you like if you look up the hashtag Keep Eyes on Sudan, a lot of stuff is uploaded through there. So yeah. And yeah, also, something that myself and lots of Sudanese people are passionate about is like, we are more than just the war, and taking the opportunity to, like, every Sudanese will tell you within 10 minutes of meeting them that we have more pyramids than Egypt, like, so learning a little bit. I know the British Museum has a huge exhibition on at the moment about sort of archaeological treasures from Sudan and so on. So I think kind of exploring it and getting to know it as a place that is wonderful and thriving and not just kind of the current conflict can also be fun.
Thank you so much, Yassmin. Is there anything that you wish we would have asked you that we haven't asked you?
Maybe the last thing I'll kind of say is that, like, you asked about kind of hope and the future. Some of the art and the music and the culture that's come out of this era, again, even though it's such a strange time, there is just such beautiful creativity that's come out as well. And maybe the last thing that I'll say is, like, I don't think Sudanese people want to be pitied. Sudanese people have managed to kind of like get themselves, like, the emergency response rooms are incredible in their ability to essentially, they've created or they've replaced the state, in terms of, and they've done the work of international humanitarian organizations. And so if there's anything that, if you want to be inspired rather than just kind of despair at how awful the conflict is pay attention to the incredible work that is being done on the ground, because we are not to be pitied, we're to be celebrated.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.